Well, first we have to talk about some bad news. And I think that's kind of difficult for Christians because we like to talk about good news. And that's what the gospel is about. And oftentimes, I think Christians shy away from opening up with difficult stories and difficult sets of statistics and issues about change. And I want to, I think, share with you my rationale for doing this first, and then maybe talk about one or two of the specifics that you'll be reading in the first part of Christianity After Religion. Occasionally, I've been accused of writing what's called literary nonfiction. And that is, I spend an enormous amount of time as a writer thinking about the structure of books and thinking about language. So I'm not just simply going in and trying to write a book about stuff, but I'm actually trying to write a story. And there are a couple of different ways of approaching storytelling. One way is kind of a classic narrative arc, and that is the author will start a story with a problem or an issue or some sort of idea, and then she will build evidence in the story. And so you begin here with a question, you build the evidence, you create a narrative, and then you get to some part of the story that is the culmination of the story. And from that point, you then bring readers out to a conclusion. So most stories, especially nonfiction, go like this. And that is a typical narrative arc for a book. There's a different kind of narrative arc, and that is a negative narrative arc or a reverse narrative arc. And that's where the author presents a problem or an issue, same way as you would in a classic kind of story. And instead of going up and building evidence that moves towards a conclusion, the author brings you in and then pushes you off a cliff. And that is a negative arc. And then down here in the bottom, you sort of muddle around for a long time with problems and issues, and you wonder if the hero is ever going to get out of the story. And finally, there will be some sort of path that opens up towards a different future, and the person in the story begins to climb out, and then you get the resolution. These kinds of narrative arcs are very evident in our literature. When I was a little girl, most stories had positive narrative arcs. I think about books that influenced me, like Little Women. It's very clearly a classic narrative kind of arc story. But my daughter, I have a daughter who's 14, and one of the things that's very intriguing to me is that most of young adult and children's literature right now is not written with a positive narrative arc. It's actually written with the reverse narrative arc. So you think of something like Harry Potter, or you think of the new series, The Hunger Games. Those are all books that the author brings the readers in, shoves you off a cliff, and then you wonder how you're ever going to get out. Well, that's how my new book is. As a matter of fact, I was somewhere a couple weeks ago, and a woman who was reading the book said, you know, those first 3 chapters scared me to death. I never thought we'd get out of them. And that's really what I intend, is that I wanted to put you into a dark place. To use the Christian language instead of a literary language, the first 3 chapters of the book are really a via negativa. And so in that sense, those of you who might have read the book during Lent might have felt a real sort of parallel journey between the Lenten journey and the Good Friday journey with those first 3 chapters, which are all about loss and grief and change, and the sort of the sadness and sense of dislocation that comes from those. And so those first 3 chapters are indeed bad news. I think about those chapters at the beginning of the book, and for me, the most important story that I tell there, although I quote a dizzying amount of statistics, as one reviewer said, the most important story comes towards the beginning, and it's the story that I tell about Ellen. I was writing this book in the summer of 2010, and it was in that year that I started testing some of the ideas on my Facebook page and my blog, and I asked some questions about people who had left church. I was interested in knowing stories about leave taking, and I was astonished because so many people responded to that, not only on the public part of the blog, but I was besieged with stories that people sent me via my private email. I don't even know how people got on private email, but they started sending me stuff. And I would read so many tales of woundedness, of loss, of fear, people who were rejecting religion, not because necessarily they wanted to, but for some or another reason they felt like they had actually been shoved out of church. But the most compelling story of all the stories I read came on the public part of the blog. It came in the comment section from a woman that I'm sure I do not know, and I don't even know if Ellen is her real name. But she told a story about how she had grown up as a minister's daughter in a mainline church. She referred to it as a white bread mainline church, which I really kind of liked. That described the church of my youth. I was a Methodist growing up, and I think that's a perfect description. And that she left when she went to college, as many people her age did. I sensed she was a baby boomer by the way she told the story. Then, as a young woman, she married, she had kids, she decided to go back to church. She started out by becoming part of I believe she said she became an Episcopalian. And she was in a diocese which was fractured by arguments about the role of women, and she got very disheartened by the fighting. And she felt that people were not practicing what they preached. And so that sense of the hypocrisy of her particular church or diocese drove her out. And so she went to a Roman Catholic congregation. And it was at that church, she says in her testimony, that she appreciated the emphasis on social justice, but she began to have more and more questions about the way that authority was exercised in the church. And she could not go along with the fact that lay people were not invited to participate in the fullness of communion, and she wondered how that had developed, and she began to feel very much like the priests did not appreciate the gifts of the laity. So eventually she left the Catholic Church. And her third sort of attempt to find a church community was some evangelical church. It sounded like it was a rather large and successful church. And she liked the fact that people there read the Bible, they took their spiritual lives seriously. But she also was turned off by the fact that eventually it caught up to her that you had to agree with the particular interpretation of the Bible in order to be truly welcomed in the congregation. And so Ellen just left church. And the reason I find that story compelling is that some people might interpret it that Ellen is a sort of a dissatisfied church shopper. You know, she could never make a commitment. She went from one place to another, never being satisfied. But I don't think Ellen was that at all. I think what Ellen's story tells us is that here was a person who really, truly wanted to find a faith community, and that everywhere she turned, she found a disconnect between what people practiced and what they preached. And she found a disconnect between the ability to really live her life for God and the structures of the church. And those kinds of disconnects eventually just led her to give up. And after trying so hard for what sounded like 2 or 2.5 decades, Ellen has just gone out on her own. And I hear that story, and that's the sort of the summary story of all the bad news section of the book, is that I think that the world is really full of Ellens right now. And that is a sad commentary on the church. But it also gives me a sense of hope, because if we can step into that gap and be a different kind of church, there are people out there who do want to commit their lives to a community, but they want it to be a community in which they find genuine faithfulness, a genuine sense of empowerment, and a genuine encounter with God. And so are we really that? Do we really practice what we preach? That's what the bad news asks us. Can we be a community that embodies the life of Christ powerfully in the world? And will people see it?